On behalf of festival co-directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World. Those of you who missed our earlier sessions featuring Nobel laureates Professor Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, Venki Ramakrishnan and Nurhan Pamuk, and award-winning writers Margaret Atwood, Jhumpa Lahiri, Maza Mangiste, Peter Frankopan, and so many others, you can view these on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, or on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM, Bajate Raho. JLF Brave New World marks Bloomsday today, the 16th of June, in partnership with the Embassy of Ireland and lovers of literature from across the world to celebrate James Joyce's greatest modernist masterpiece, Ulysses. Two of the greatest living Irish writers, Paul Muldoon and Colm Tóibín, discussed the influence of Joyce and Irish literature with Booker-shortlisted poet and novelist Jeet Thayil. Together, they explore why Ulysses still matters today. Paul Muldoon is a former radio and television producer for the BBC in Belfast. He's the author of 13 collections of poetry, including Moist Sand and Gravel, for which he won the 2003 Pulitzer Prize, and the recent Frolic and Detour. Colm Tóibín is the author of several novels, including The Blackwater Lightship, The Master, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, Brooklyn, winner of the Costa Book Award, A Testament to Mary and Nora Webster, as well as two collections of short stories, and of course, Mad, Bad, Dangerous to Know, a look at three 19th century Irish authors. Jeet Thayil worked as a journalist for 23 years in Bombay, Bangalore, Hong Kong, and New York. His first novel, Narcopolis, was awarded the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature and was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. His 5 poetry collections include These Errors Are Correct, which won him the Sahitya Academy Award. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it in the comment section below, and Jeet will ask these of our speakers. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And of course, if we drop off, or in this case, if Jeet drops off, just hang in there and we'll be right back on Facebook. Ladies and gentlemen, celebrating Bloomsday, Paul Muldoon and Colm Tóibín in conversation with Jeet Thayil in association with the Embassy of Ireland.
Hi, everybody. Real pleasure to be here with Colm Tóibín and Paul Muldoon. If you're wondering what relevance poetry and literary fiction might have in the dread year 2020, and what relevance James Joyce and Ulysses might have in the dread year 2020, well, we hope to have an answer for you over the course of this conversation. Welcome to you, gentlemen. And could you tell us where you're talking from and what time of night or day it is where you are?
Well, I'm speaking from on high. I'm speaking from New York State, the Mohawk Valley, and it's now 11:05 a.m. So that's where I am.
Colm?
Colm, I think you're on mute. We need to just unmute you.
Can you hear me now?
I think we lost your audio. Yes, can hear you now.
You can hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, I'm in California, in Los Angeles, and it's 8:05 in the morning here. The birds are chirping outside.
Right. I'm in Bangalore, and it's 8:30 p.m. I just would like to start by asking each of you what you've been doing during quarantine, and has it been pretty much business as usual, or have you been in a personal lockdown as well in terms of writing? Paul?
You know, I hate to say that it's business as usual, because this is clearly a time when certainly there is much happening worldwide on so many fronts. So I don't want to sound smug or somehow insular when I say that actually for me as a writer, very little has changed about for my day-to-day activity. I get up, 5 o'clock in the morning, and basically I start scribbling, and that's just what I do. That's not to say that I don't think about what's happening on the streets. Of course I do. But basically, from day to day, it's actually been an opportunity to do a lot of work.
Colm? I think your audio has dropped again.
What about this?
Yes, you're back. You're back.
Yeah, like Paul, I've been watching the news. I've been watching some of the news with absolute horror, and I've been in touch with home a lot with Ireland. But what I've been doing is I've been revising a novel and writing a story, and I'm doing a lot of reading. And so it is a sort of lockdown social distancing that anyone who's writing has. I mean, you spend a lot of time on your own. So it isn't the end of the world for me. Personally, I'm privileged in that way. I haven't lost my job. But at the same time, sometimes you watch what's happening, especially in America, with absolute just disbelief, really.
Yeah, I don't think this is to say that one is smug about this, not at all. Though one of the things that has occurred to me, and I hope you don't mind my bringing this up, is that we perhaps too readily accept that there's something out of the ordinary, abnormal about this moment. And what I would want to suggest is that the global pandemic, or certainly disease, has been a feature of our lives for as long as we've been around, and certainly for as long as we've been around pigs and chickens, which is quite a long time. So, I'm struck even by the fact that in Ulysses there's a disease which has taken over the country, which of course is foot and mouth disease. And, if it's not foot and mouth disease, it's something else. And I actually think there's something to be gained in reminding oneself of that, and maybe even cherishing the fact that this is how it is. This is what it is to be human.
And it's also interesting that he finished writing Ulysses in 1921, which was just after the flu pandemic of 1918 to 1920, which killed 50 to 100 million people worldwide. So here we are, 100 years after the publication of Ulysses. And I'm wondering if that might be one of the ways in which the novel could be relevant to a reader today, that it was a novel written during a pandemic worse than the one we are currently in, or we hope. Colm, does the fact that Ulysses was written during the last great pandemic make it more urgent today? Your audio.
Is this working now?
Yes, it is.
Great. I think the background to Ulysses is that it was written in the time of the breaking of nations. That in other words, if you think of the period between 1914 and 1922, and you think of Ireland, and you think of Europe, and you think of Trieste, that this was a time of trench warfare. This was a time when no one was aware how it was going to end. In the middle of the whole thing, suddenly the 1916 rebellion occurs, in which one of James Joyce's best friends is shot by the British. It's Francis Sheehy Skeffington, but he knows the others. He knows Patrick Pearse because he was in university with him. And so, and of course, as you say, ending with the great flu pandemic of 1918 into 1919. And then you have against this, the single-mindedness of the artist. Joyce working on his manuscript, managing not to be interned, as his brother Stanislaus was, managing to keep out of trouble, which is very unusual for somebody like him who was troublesome. And the extraordinary dedication of those years. And I think when you talk about relevance, we've got to be careful that it's not as though this is a political book. It doesn't mention the war. That there are many other things happening in the book, such as I think an idea that might be relevant now being that this book is written in style, in a set of clashing styles, and that no single style is dominant. and that no single opinion or attitude is dominant, and that everything hits against everything else. When you finish an episode and you go to the next one, you think, this next one is having a dispute with the previous one. Stylistically, he's actually interested in the dynamic, in thing against thing. As Bloom's mind is working, it never works in a single way. It darts, it goes backwards, it goes sideways. And I think all of that idea, the cast of mind in the book might be something entirely relevant to now. The second, I suppose there are other issues. The gender politics in the book is hugely relevant to now. And indeed is the attitude towards violence and towards nationalism. All of that is relevant now. But I think the relevance of the book remains the style, the idea of style, and the idea of clashing style, non-dominant style. I think that is really what thrills the reader of this book. And if you're looking for, I think, a political message in the book, you won't get one. But even if you're looking for a huge exploration of politics in the book, you won't really get that either. What you get in the book is the sheer delight, sometimes the sheer delight in this word being put just in here now, or this way of noticing the world, or thinking, this way of thinking, and even this way of talking. I think all of those things. So I think what matters in the book is its literary content, is the idea of the literary in the book, is what still makes the book sing to us.
I think that's absolutely right. It's because it's so well written. That's why we continue to read it, which is not to say, of course, that again, that it's somehow frolicking within its own terms. Actually, I was struck when Colm mentioned the time of the breaking of nations. Joyce's, the first word of the book, if you recall, is stately, which refers, of course, to the movement of Buck Mulligan through the Martello Tower on the south side of Dublin. But it also, in a strange way, announces that the notion of statehood, and indeed, as it turns out, one of the things the book is about is, in some profound sense, home rule. Not in the sense that we ordinarily think of it in Ireland or perhaps in India. And I'm always struck by the fact that the Indian independence movement was inspired so profoundly by the Irish independence movement. But it is a book in which the notion of home, returning home, of course, but home is a constant among so many, many other aspects of life on which it touches. And again, I think that's the beauty of it. It's not about a single thing. It doesn't have a single theme. It may in some sense be reduced to a couple of sentences that one would pitch to a Broadway producer in an elevator. But it is, finally, it cannot be boiled down to a couple of sentences.
Which might be why we've talked about it for as long as we have, which is why the conversation keeps going on. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Great. There are ways that you can read the book politically, and they're interesting. In that, as it became clear that Ireland, as Paul says, was going to become a state, that this nation was going to have its parliament in its capital city, everyone who wrote in those years is writing to this. In other words, trying to imagine what sort of Ireland will come into being. Obviously, W.B. Yeats is doing this all the time in various ways, including in the theatre, in the collection of folklore, and in poems. But for Joyce, the placing at the centre of the book of a man who's cosmopolitan in his style, who is deeply sexualized in the book, who is not a hero, not a sexual hero or a financial hero, but a wandering man who just notices things and has an attitude towards everything. It's a blueprint against insularity. It's suggesting a sort of openness that Ireland might embrace as it becomes a state. In other words, that a Jew is at the center of the story, and a wandering young poet who he meets. And they're wandering in a city where so many different styles and systems are available to them. It's city Ireland. It's not rural Ireland. And I think that blueprint is political. There are also other funny things in the book. For example, in Wandering Rocks, there's in the middle of everything else happening, that's the chapter in which there's a splicing, like as in film, of many different people doing many different things in individual sort of paragraphs. In the middle of the whole thing, a cavalcade comes, and it's the Lord Lieutenant who's running Ireland for the Crown, and the entourage, and they move snakily through all this world we've just been looking at. And what's fascinating is that no one boos them, shouts abuse at them, or says anything rude to them. That it's as though that this 1904 Dublin is oddly compliant, that it's living within the empire quite peacefully and easily. And of course, this is the great irony for Joyce as he's writing the book all these years later. So that there's one moment, only one in the book, where you see him losing the chronology. I mean, in other words, it's meant to be set in 1904. Nothing after 1904, therefore, can be mentioned. But in a list of people, including who's the executioner of Robert Emmet, he mentions a Major Maxwell Tomlinson. And of course, General Maxwell, was the man who ordered the executions of 1916. And he's thrown in for a second. His name is just put in as just as a little sign. I know I'm writing after. I know this is actually an historical novel, because of course the difference between 1922 and 1904 is really enormous. It's not just at 18 years. It's the cataclysms have occurred, and so he is playing sometimes with the idea of a compliant population, of a population under the empire. And then, of course, in Cyclops, in the episode, you get a big debate over what is an island, what is a nation, what is a citizen. And of course, all of this is ironized, because the great thing about the book is no single dominant, nothing is taken fully seriously. In other words, if anything is established as serious, it's knocked down in the other chapter. There's another thing that occurs to me, which is in Oxen of the Sun, which is the one where he parodies every style of English prose, from the sort of medieval style right through Middle English up into Lord Macaulay and various other figures, that this is an empire moment. This is the boy who's been studying the textbook the Jesuits gave him, showing how the slow progress of this English language has developed in various systems of prose. And he has learned this in school, as somebody would learn it in India, in an English-speaking school, or would learn it indeed in South Africa, or indeed in London, or indeed in Scotland. In other words, this is the empire at work, and this is Joyce actually showing off how much he learned about the history of English prose during this time. So I think there are many ways you can see the book as you can read it in small political ways.
Down to the chapter where there are questions about the book and about the characters in the book, and there are answers to the questions, just as if you were looking through a textbook.
Yes, or a catechism in the Catholic tradition, the series of questions and answers. Yes, I mean, that again, that's one of the things he's so wonderful at in the Oxen of the Sun. It begins actually with an Irish word, Jeshel. Jeshel, I think I'm right in saying, which means Jasanoff, going in a good direction, going with the sun, which is where it fits in there. So he does indeed take into account, and not everyone accepts that Joyce had some much more than a passing sense of the Gaelic tradition. But he had enough sense of it to be able to kick off that great literary chapter with that word Jeshel.
And for a book that begins with the word stately and ends with the word yes, one of the things that come to mind for somebody in India reading Ulysses, and a hugely kind of influential book in India as well, reading while brown is an entirely different experience to reading while white. And for a brown or black reader coming to Ulysses in the mid or late 20th century, as I did, there's a kind of an emotional charge in the fact that Joyce takes a very specific stand in the race wars, the idea that one race is superior to another. And I think it's safe to say that in Ulysses, you see a real kind of contempt for racism and racists and for bigotry in all its forms, and which is an attitude that's nothing if not contemporary and relevant to this moment. And for example, that the character Mr. DC, this England is in the hands of the Jews. And there's a description of Mr. DC's laugh, which is a description that is so filled with disgust that we know exactly where Joyce stands in response to racists. And it's good to know that he was on the right side of history.
Yes, I think the book has a sort of tenderness in relation to others that is expressed, I think, mainly by Bloom. Stephen, unfortunately, every so often just gets so involved in an argument he wishes to have that really makes no sense a lot of the time. And he's sort of wandering lost, but Bloom feels a tenderness towards others. He feels it towards women, and he feels it towards everyone he passes on the street. He feels it towards the orphan in the novel Paddy Dignam's son. He feels it towards Paddy Dignam's widow. He feels it towards mankind in general, but what Joyce does with this is he makes it sensual, he makes it personal, he brings it down to the moment so that you watch Bloom responding to each thing. Sometimes his mind is gloriously funny. There's a marvelous moment where he's quite puzzled by Catholicism. And so he's thinking about the Mass. He's walking up Westland Row and thinking about the Mass and thinking, what a dignified thing wine is to move wine into the blood rather than ginger ale. I think it's a tremendously good joke. His mind in that moment for me is the most sparkling, brilliant mind. You think, actually, this mind, and that in other words, he's funny sometimes, but often something really puzzles him, and then often something really shocks him. So there's I think what I would call the word I would use is tender about his mind.
The word tender is a word he uses rather splendidly, actually. You mentioned the wine column, but even when he's looking at some of the inner organs, he refers to the kidney as a moist, tender gland. So his tenderness extends in a couple of directions, and that is the glory of what Joyce has achieved here, as you say, is that he's able to include everything. That's one of his methods. Is as you know better than I do, is one of inclusion.
Well, that's the moment where he's making breakfast and he burns the kidneys while he's serving tea to Molly. But I was also reminded of when you were talking, Colm, I was reminded of the exchange with the citizen and the pub boy in the pub who asks Bloom the question every immigrant has heard more times than we might care to remember. And that is the question, but where are you really from? And Bloom says he's from Ireland, at which point the citizen spits into a corner of the bar. And you're reminded of the phrase which occurs a little bit later when Joyce says, the old pap of race hatred. And, you're also reminded that he was an Irishman who left Ireland, made himself a man of the world, made himself as comfortable in Paris and Zurich as he had been in Dublin, and someone who refused to go back to Ireland to the extent that they refused to bury him there after he died. Paul, you emigrated to the United States in 1987. Tell us something about the experience of being a migrant Irishman to the United States.
Well, I have to say that I have had I don't want to sound smug about this, but a blessed time in that regard, and for whatever reason, and I certainly have not experienced anything that so many of the people who were born and brought up in this country have experienced in terms of exclusion. I mean, I cannot say that I have not been accepted in this country. So, I mean, I just can't say that. It wouldn't be appropriate. And you know, the Irish have not always been welcome in this part of the world, but I think in the last 50 years, certainly, I think it's fair to say that we have. Colm, what do you think of that? I mean, you've been here for a long time too.
Yeah, I don't have any complaints, but I do think it's different if you came from, say, the former Yugoslavia, or you came from India, or you came from Africa, into New York, and you could be asked very easily, but what's your nation? I mean, where are you from? And I think what's happened, especially in England, I think, is that the hyphen has become this great object. I mean, we didn't think about hyphens much. There's no great, I don't think there's an ode to the hyphen, but this idea of a hyphenated identity of saying, well, I'm both.
Mm-hmm.
That I cheer for the Irish team, but I actually pay my taxes in England, or that has happened in England. The integration and the idea that you know, that Norman Tebbit said, well, you're only English if you cheer for the English cricket team, and some say, no, that's just not true. That those days are over, when there's a sort of mono response, that we're in stereo enough, everyone doesn't mind. And so, you know, I can be in New York with an Irish accent. With, you know, and if someone, what often happens is someone says, are you British? They use the word British. Are you British? And I sort of love the idea. Oh my God, after all these years, I'm British. Like, I don't even mind being British. But Bloom, I think that lovely little encounter at the very center of the book, where Bloom is suddenly thoughtful. He suddenly becomes almost melancholy against all these drunken Irish people talking nonsense in the pub. He wants to say something true. He wants to talk about love. And he wants to talk about the opposite to hatred. Yes, it's love. And the men have no idea how to handle this. And you watch him with a group of men, almost moving out of his masculinity into some other state, which is a constant thing in the book, where he's so uncertain about his very identity as a man. And of course, there's something very funny that Joyce cannot resist doing, which is, yes, his father was Hungarian. So that means he's a complete outsider. Well, not necessarily, because the idea for Sinn Féin itself came from Hungary. And there's a book by Arthur Griffith, its founder, about the possible relationship between what Hungary was doing within the Austro-Hungarian Empire and what Ireland could do within the British Empire. And it is a rumor that it was Bloom himself who told Arthur Griffith about this, so that he, in fact, is the little guy who gave rise to Sinn Féin. But this is only a rumor. But you can see Joyce loving the idea that his little everyman, his Jewish guy wandering the city trying to sell advertisements, actually is the man who brought the news in from Hungary about how Ireland could be free. So it's a lovely moment in the book where Bloom moves from being a shadowy figure into being a central one. But Joyce, of course, is always interested in the ironies of that, rather than in its whether it's true or not.
To go back to your earlier question on how, there are so many ways in which this novel might be relevant to the moment, but actually that's one. In the realm of advertising, you know, of all the what we want to say, callings that Joyce might have chosen to foreground for his main character. The fact that he's an advertising man and he's going around trying to buy and sell space for advertising. And, you know, that is something that if we log on in the morning, 100 years later, we're certainly very conscious of that. And so that's a way in which Joyce definitely had a sense of the impact of advertising through that century.
And also, I suppose, as you were saying earlier, in the way that styles jostle against each other in each chapter. And even if that is also a kind of a showing off, where he's trying to show you what he can do as a writer and just what a virtuoso he is, it's still also extremely effective as a way of communicating a world full of images and ideas and things trying to be sold to you.
You know, I'm always amused by this idea, and one hears it. Well, there's a brilliant Irish poet called Derek Mahon. I remember a review of him, whom Colm would know, among others, who was reviewed years ago, and the complaint in the review was actually he was too good. And it's, you know, Joyce, I would much prefer to have a virtuoso in command, as it were, rather than someone who hadn't the first clue about what they were doing from sentence to sentence, which, let's face it, is what we have most of the time. So, you know, one can see that there might be a slightly self-admiring aspect to that, but I'd say in general, that's certainly a risk that it takes. But with Joyce, I believe it's a risk that if indeed he does take it, he overcomes most of the time.
And you mean it might be excused?
Well, I mean, okay, one doesn't want to stop. Colm knows more about this than I do, but one doesn't want to stop with every sentence and say, my heavens, what a sentence that was. Yeah. However, if it's a choice between that and saying, my God, what a completely terrible sentence that was, I would choose the first, but maybe I'm wrong. I mean, the fact is one ordinarily doesn't want to be stopped at all. And most of the time, actually, one does not stop. One is carried along by this prose.
Yeah, I don't think you can say that Ulysses is beautifully written. When he wants to do that, he does it ironically. He writes beautifully to show you just what sugary writing looks like, to make fun of it. The best writing in the book is the sharp writing, is the 3-word sentence. When went up, did he see, didn't meet, saw him later. Him? Who? You know, and what's strange about that is that he can make that clipped, cut down prose into something poetic, by which I mean that oddly, by just using 3 words, he can give them a resonance with their sound, with something that they contain that isn't obvious, and you're being pulled along by this quite sour, reduced rhythm. And he works with this very, very well. This is when he's not parodying, when he's not in high flown tone, just showing how much command he has. When he's down there in the mind, trying to register what Bloom is thinking, feeling, and noticing. That's clipped, and it's very simple. But so he's interested in style. He's interested in demolishing the idea of fictional space in which everything represents something and the plot is pure and it will end in a wedding. But at the same time, there are connections between the people in the novel that are interesting. And the connections basically have to do with music. That the reason Molly Bloom knows Blazes Boylan is that she's a singer and he's a producer. The reason why they know Simon Dedalus is that Molly has sung with him. The reason why they know Ben Dollard is that he has sung with Simon Dedalus. So that they already know Stephen. They actually have met him when he was younger with his father via music. Mm-hmm. Now, this idea of song in the novel is really important because Joyce has a reason to resent his father. His father was one of the unluckiest men who ever lived. I mean, not just unlucky that he lost jobs or that he lost all his money or that he couldn't stop drinking, but he had a son in the house, and it's the biggest nuisance to ever think of, who kept diaries. And Stanislaus was bitter and filled with resentment. He hated his father, and he had 2 books published posthumously, one, The Dublin Diary of Stanislaus Joyce, and the other called My Brother's Keeper, and they were really about what a nightmare the father was. Now, James Joyce has a choice here. He can get a lifelong books of resentment, what an awful business was being brought up in the Joyce household. And what he wants to do, and this is the first sign of the sort of amplitude that will come, the sort of levels of generosity that will emerge in his style as a writer, that he will forgive his father very early in the business. So he will present him in Ulysses at the very center as this man who has a beautiful singing voice. And he will sing Ma Paris from Float Up's Martha, and Bloom will watch him thinking, that voice, that voice. Molly, in her soliloquy, will go over it again, what Simon Dedalus' voice was like. So Joyce socialized his father. He brought him out of the house where he caused nothing but trouble. You know, street angel, house devil. He made the street angel out of him. He's witty. People listen to him. He's often melancholy. He's not just a troublemaker. Now, if you move one step further with that idea of song, why is song so intense in, say, the story of the dead? Why is it so intense in Ulysses that every time someone's going to sing or snatches of songs, performance itself? And if you look at the countries, and you're talking around 1904, which were ideas of nations without parliaments, nations that were not states. I'm talking about, say, Catalonia, Scotland, Bengal, Ireland. In those years, at the beginning of the 20th century, song, the choral, became intense and an essential part of what was the sort of shadow nation building. That somehow, when the utterance that comes from a parliament, reported in the newspapers each day, the orderly business of voting, of reporting debate, of orderly debate, when that couldn't happen in a country, but the country sort of wanted it. If you look at the amount of work being done, say, in Barcelona in around 1900, around choirs, around the collection of songs, the singing of songs, and singing itself somehow taking on a power much greater than mere entertainment, somehow bringing a sets of disparate emotions together into one space. And you find that in Scotland, and you find it in Bengal, that idea of nationalism in these years needing a sort of a cultural lead, and that cultural lead coming from poetry sometimes, but also, I think, more intensely sometimes coming from song. And so the idea of song in Ulysses is not just there to connect the characters or give us scenes. I think it has a more intense power and a more, I think you can actually read it politically if you want to, but it soars above politics, which is where its power comes from, that it both expresses some set of almost unmentionable wishes in a way that matters and gives people that emotional outlet. That sort of nationalism is so filled with ideas of emotions that can't quite be named or can't quite be contained. And song actually does that or works with that.
We're 3 minutes away from audience questions. I just wanted to ask one thing. Today is June 16th, and in 3 days it's going to be Juneteenth, a word that is top of the mind in America at the moment. I'm reminded that when the war happened, Joyce told Beckett that his main objection to it was that it would interfere with the release of Finnegan's Wake, and nobody was going to read Finnegan's Wake because everybody was going to be thinking about the war. So in terms of Bloomsday and Juneteenth, you have to wonder how much he would have cared,
Cared about what? About the fact that they're celebrated at all?
No, about Juneteenth and whether it matters and whether it would only take away some of the attention that Bloomsday would have received otherwise. I mean, I'm not taking a moral stand, I'm just saying it just seems like a Joycean response.
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, I think he was he was fascinated. I mean, Colm mentions that representation of the cavalcade through the streets of Dublin. In The Dead, which you've just mentioned, and indeed in Finnegan's Wake also, some of the public monuments, the statue of Wellington, the Duke of Wellington in particular, these public manifestations of historical moments, I think, are part of his skyline. to be commented upon. I mean, I'm not sure, but to go back to your question, I don't know if he would be so self-enthralled as to say, well, Finnegan's Wake is more important than Juneteenth. I'm not quite sure he would say that.
Yeah, I take that line with Beckett as being a very good joke. In other words, that as the world is crashing down around him, the two men are sitting there and they're very sour about everything. And he said, yeah, the big thing that I worry about is the reception of Finnegan's Wake. And they both say, yeah, but obviously they don't mean it. I mean, it isn't there for a moment. But I think it's a very good joke. And I think it would have cheered them up immensely, that idea that it was the book, it's Hitler came after my book. But I really, really don't think Joyce actually it really thought that the real fascism really was really directed against Finnegan's Wake.
I mean, I'm sure it was a joke, and it's a very good one. It made me laugh when I read first, and it still makes me laugh. But I think there might have been a little kernel of truth in there, as there often is with jokes. We have a first question from the audience. I'm going to try and kind of translate it and compress it a little bit. Sachdev Ramakrishnan asks, there is so much that's epic about the life of Ulysses. On one end, its admirers included Jung and T.S. Eliot, who said that it's a book that we are indebted to and from which none of us can escape. At the same time, there's censorship everywhere and critics rubbish it. On balance, what is it?
Well, in the case of T.S. Eliot, it's important to remember just what a significant feature of Eliot's life Ulysses was. He read it as it was been serialized, and the mythic method, as he described what Joyce was up to, was one that he took over wholesale. I mean, borrowed, stole, who's to say, for his own great modernist masterpiece, which came out in the same year, The Wasteland. What do you say?
Same year, 1922. Yeah.
So basically, Eliot really had a lot to thank Joyce for in that regard, and I think many casual readers are not even conscious of the importance of Ulysses to T.S. Eliot.
Yeah, I think because he called it rhythmic grumbling, you can misread the poem, but it's so filled with the street, with Mrs. Porter and her daughter, and they wash their feet in soda water, and good night, ladies. The whole business of voices coming against each other, and tones and textures coming against each other, that it's, as Paul says, it's sometimes it's astonishing to see. These two works appeared more or less at the same time, using the same systems, as though, but of course, bits of Ulysses had been appearing, so that, I mean, the idea of Eliot reading it. I also love the idea of Eliot's English accent and his general tone and his four-piece suits and all that him having to read all about various people in Dublin, wandering about, talking in a very particular Irish tone. I just love the idea of what Joyce did. In other words, he forced the world to come into Ireland. Just one more thing I want to say about that. He doesn't explain ever what he's talking about when he talks about an Irish thing. Robert Emmet, for example, just throwing in a name, the croppy boy. So many things Irish people will get, but the outside world has no idea. So this massive annotation you need, if you're an outsider, to know what is he talking about now, because he doesn't explain. You know, it's written for Irish readers, even though they paid no attention at the beginning. It is written for an Irish audience, which is something Toni Morrison talked about, where she was writing her novels for African-American readers first. If the rest of the world wanted to listen later, that was fine with her. But her audience were African-Americans, and similarly with Joyce.
And 100 years later, of course, there's so many problems with the internet, but so many glories, one of which is the fact that we're able to take part in the Jaipur Literary Festival. Another is the fact that if you don't know who or what the Croppy Boy might be, or Robert Emmett, you can find out very, very quickly. So it's a book that, in a strange way, is maybe read even more readily in this moment than it was 100 years ago.
In terms of The Wasteland, and that it was also published in 1922, I often think about The Bridge, another great kind of epic poem, American epic poem that really belongs on that same shelf, because the technique there, the styles, the way he uses advertising, the way he uses catchphrases and ads and visuals and talks about images, it's very much in keeping with The Wasteland and with Ulysses. And I'm sure there was a lot of kind of cross-pollination going on there. We have a... Go ahead.
Yes, I mean, that's the essence of modernism, isn't it? Or perhaps even postmodernism. I wouldn't want to have to distinguish between the two. But, this is the heap of broken images that has been a constant right through the 20th century as an emblem for it. And it doesn't look as if it's any less applicable at the beginning of the 21st.
We have a question from Sonia, who asks, who says, Virginia Woolf calls D.H. Lawrence and James Joyce overrated. What are your comments?
I think the phrase she used was underbred. And it's a lovely idea because it's sort of Tavistock Square, it's Bloomsbury, just looking at all these Irish people sitting in pubs and people shitting and, masturbating. And I think she just thought, and also there's a moment in Cyclops where there's a big list of priests, just a big long list of priests and their names, and all the different, one was a Monsignor and CC and DD and all the different, and you thought, what would Virginia Woolf, what was she to make of this? And so, Virginia Woolf has many, many virtues, and including ones which we've been talking about, the idea of getting fragmented, and also working with trying to register consciousness. But I can just see her problem with Ulysses, that it's actually an English-Irish problem, that she just couldn't get the jokes. Whereas sometimes the jokes for me are jokes that I've been hearing all my life. So yeah, poor old Virginia, she didn't get that. Yeah.
We have a inevitable question in India, and that is this is Chaitanya, who wants to know, who asks, could you please discuss the influence of the Upanishads on Joyce, as he quotes so eloquently in Ulysses? Paul, I know you're dying to answer this one.
I have to say I am not. Funnily enough, my sense of the Upanishads comes mostly, and perhaps even almost exclusively, from the Wasteland. But so I am not really equipped to answer that. I don't really. What are the references there now? Do you remember what they are in particular? I mean, one of the things about Joyce is that, his range of references is just astonishing, So I've no doubt that he, not only is he alluding to the Upanishads, but he actually knows quite a lot about them. But I'm not an expert on that, I fear. Sorry about that.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. We are 3 minutes from the end of the session, and there is a question from Rohan, who says, what is the role of music in the James Joyce story, The Dead?
Colm was speaking so eloquently there about music in Ulysses and its central role, and I was thinking as he was speaking, actually, in terms of the plot, as it were, of The Dead, I mean, what forces the moment to its crisis. I'm slightly rejigging a line of Eliot. In The Dead is Greta's hearing the distant music, as she describes it, of this song, The Lass of Aughrim, and her associations with that song, her profound association with her memory of her childhood boyfriend, whatever, love, Michael Fury, is actually what sets off her realization that her relationship with Gabriel Conroy is not quite what it was. And then, of course, set upon that, following upon that, Gabriel's realization, his epiphany, the showing forth for him that actually their relationship isn't everything it might have been, which is at the core of that story. So I would, to answer your question, it has a central role in that story. The story, of course, is set in the milieu, as we say, of that Colm mentioned vis-a-vis Ulysses, of the kind of the light opera world of Dublin, the kind of the singing societies, the chorales, you know, where they're all absolutely au fait with the singers who have been through the Olympia. That's the world in which they live. Colm.
Yeah, the song brings the emotion. Nothing else would do it. In other words, if someone said a word, and they've been talking about music earlier in the story, The Dead, where one of the aunts talks about a tenor called Parkinson. No one else has ever heard of him, but he was the one for me. He was the one. And there was this distant, dead voice of his. No one else remembers except her. That music, the music has stayed with her. And we come then to this idea that the only thing that will work now, will have to be evoked, is a song, and a song of lost love, a song of impossible love, and that will actually bring her back to this love that she lost. And so the song will do all the work in the story that is hard to think what anything else could do, but the song will do it. Now, with the length of time listening to the sound, the voice soaring and going down, that will bring an emotion, and that emotion for her will be entirely personal, and very, very strong, and it's beautifully evoked in the story. Because one of the problems about it, it's really hard to write about music in prose, because you always feel you know what you're talking about, but the listener, you need to press a button to hear it, so you can't actually give. You have to be really careful not to think that you can easily evoke sound or singing in prose. You can't, but in that story you do.
Well, one of the ways he got around that was by actually reproducing musical scores on the page, and I'm sure that might have been the first time in the history of the novel that a writer had thought of doing that. We have probably a last question. I think we're done. Time out. Yeah, we're done.
Thank you, Jeet, and thank you, Paul and Colm. That was just fascinating. I mean, it was beyond fascinating. I have a question, if you both permit me. Has there been song on the streets for Black Lives Matter? And have you heard song on whether it's in California or wherever?
Well, I certainly have been to a demonstration / protest, but it did not have a song component. This particular one that I had, we of course remember the '60s, and both in the US and Ireland, and the power of "We Shall Overcome," the signature tune, as it were, of both the civil rights movement in the US and indeed in Northern Ireland. But I just don't know if there's a song that, or a piece of music that has taken that role here. I don't know. Do you, Colin?
No, I don't. But I noticed there's a poem in today's New York Times by Jericho Brown, which has elements of song in it, and yes, which is about what's happening now, both with the pandemic and with Black Lives Matter. So
right. I suspect that social distancing is not is not conducive to people being in tune.
Well, singing is very, very dangerous with the coronavirus because of the whole idea. So choirs have been really decimated by it. And it's a fascinating idea that because of the amount.
Exactly what happened in that church, where the choir spread it to the entire congregation because of the force involved in singing. You know,
Yes.
the droplets, they're the best
But
friends of the droplets.
what has been fascinating is in the hyphenated African American context, song and gospel has always been so important in taking or bringing about change, or taking in many ways the war to the front lines. And here, for the first time, perhaps, yes, of course, you see a lot of anger and a lot of chanting and all of that. But what has been missing is perhaps, like you said, for nation building, for nationalism, the sense of change, the dynamism of, and in many ways, what song stands for, a peaceful
I think
protest.
you have to remember, it often takes time. That Yeats's poem, Easter 1916, was written in September 1916, but really not published until 1921. And that often it's 5 years later you look. But I think in the African American experience, what I've been talking about earlier to do with powerlessness and utterance and song, of course jazz comes from powerlessness. Of course the blues comes from powerlessness. And it's that same idea in Ulysses as the sheer, like the political powerlessness of the characters emerging not as protest, but as actual utterance and song. And that is something I think we can connect to the African American experience to the extraordinary way in which the powerlessness flourished of sound and became worldwide, and not only lifted everyone's spirits, but gave people a sense of the sort of dignity and the sort of extraordinary glittering talents that were being oppressed and undermined in America.
Fabulous. Of course, I'd love to have carried on that conversation and asked you both about what you felt about HBO removing Gone with the Wind. But I know we've run out of time, and thank you all so much for listening in, and a very big thank you from JLF's Brave New World to Paul Muldoon, Colm Tóibín, and Jeet Thayil for this fascinating, brilliant conversation. And I think from all of us at Teamwork, and of course from the Embassy of Ireland, a big thank you. For those of you who we weren't able to get your questions out to Jeeta, I know we had a rocky beginning on, I think, Facebook. We do apologize, but of course, the session will be on YouTube, Jaipur Lit Fest JLF, and of course, on Facebook on JLF Lit Fest. So you can go back there and revisit it. We will repost it. And thank you very much, our official radio partners, Red FM Bajate Raho. We hope you enjoyed this conversation, and we'll log back on tomorrow when we are honored to be presenting His Holiness the Dalai Lama in conversation with Piku Iyer. In The Seed of Compassion, His Holiness speaks of finding love and peace in our confused, divided, and chaotic world, and right now conflicted world, and of the universal value of compassion in these troubled times. The live telecast of this session will be at, and listen to this carefully because it's a little complicated. So the live telecast is at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning on the 17th, and the retelecast is at 7:30 p.m., both for Indian Standard Time. It's 4:30 a.m. and 3 p.m. British Summer Time on the 17th, and it's 11:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on the 16th of June, with a repeat telecast of this session at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on the 17th of June. Our second session tomorrow is Neil Ferguson and Maya Jasanoff in conversation. Award-winning economic historian Neil Ferguson, who is the Milback Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, and a Senior Faculty Fellow of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard, speaks with Maya Jasanoff, the Coolidge Professor of History at Harvard University, about the history of pandemics and share their perspectives on one of the most pressing questions of our times. And this will be at 9 p.m. IST, 4:30 p.m. British Summer Time, and 11:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Look forward to welcoming you on board tomorrow. Till then, have a great day.